Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for our second session of our Virtual Investor Series with Robin. Robin, thanks again for joining us.
You bet. Thank you, Andy.
For those of you who might not have watched the first video, my name is Andy Langsford. I'm the founder of Venture Real Estate Group. Our first session, we went over a smaller 7-unit project. This session, we're going to be covering a 100+ unit project that we co-developed with Robin and going over some details of the project. And Robin is a principal architect with Jackson, Maine, and is licensed in 20 states. 20, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and is a phenomenal architect, so this is going to be a great session. So we're going to jump right in.
Sounds good.
All right, great. So first, question/statement to begin with. We had this 100+ unit project, we had a big problem we're starting this session off with. We had a FAR issue when on final design review, the city came back and said, hey, you have an FAR issue. You've designed a building that's too big for your land. So we had a choice. Okay, we spent a lot of money getting to this point and we need to redesign our building. What do we do? So what we ended up doing is we could either, with an FAR issue, to try and make this real simple, we could either make the building smaller or we can make our land bigger. No one's ever probably done or heard of this before, but what we did was we actually talked with the city and bought the sidewalks from the city and made our land bigger. We had to go through public process. We have a great relationship with the city, and it ended up working out in the long term, but it was a big headache. So just wanted to actually start off, Robin, with some of the issues that you've seen and how you've overcome them.
Yeah, I can empathize, Andy. That is a stressful situation. What we do from a design standpoint is we research what the limitations are on any specific site and work from the outside in. So one of the first things we look for is what the envelope can be, how tall it can be, what the setbacks are. Floor area ratio is a big part of that. And that particular determinant is viewed differently with every single jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. For example, the city of Seattle looks at a net area for floor area ratio, and that's internal to the wall core, not to the external face, which makes significant amount of difference. And you need to know that. So other jurisdictions include basement. Seattle doesn't. Other jurisdictions may include balconies. Certain do, certain don't. So we try to get those basic rough edge space determinants resolved, and it's really important to be accurate about it up front.
Very clear.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes sometimes something gets missed like that, or maybe there isn't enough parking. Or maybe there's not enough loading spaces take up a lot of square footage. We've had that as an issue. Maybe the balconies extend too far into the right of way. There are lots of little things. Maybe the height limit wasn't accurately defined early. But the whole point of that feasibility study and then a follow-up with a pre-app with the jurisdiction and all their departments is to really vet those issues. And then we take that vetting, asking tough questions if they aren't answered, and maybe there's a follow-up or two. And then we go ahead.
Sorry, how many times do you follow up on an issue if you don't have it clear?
If we don't have it clear, we will bird dog it until it's resolved.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of a pre-app or a pre-sub, is that you have the attention of the jurisdiction at that point. You have a face and an app and an email and a phone number for each department, and they have an obligation, usually through the planner, to respond. And I'm probably oversimplifying it because, for example, with Seattle, SDOT, urban forestry, landscaping, planning, zoning, they're all overlapping. And it is not possible to get a concrete answer on many issues. Mm-hmm. But what you can get is a gut check on which way they're leaning. And that's all we're looking for. The whole part of the entitlement process is to vet a lot of this stuff. But things like FAR, really important to know, number one, how the jurisdiction views it. And by the way, some jurisdictions don't even have FAR. They use different things. Some don't have height limits. Seattle, Redmond does not have height limits. They have story limits, and you can increase those stories through bonuses. And some buildings in Redmond have FAR, some do not. So know that going first of all, and then working to kind of mold and sculpt that project based on those limitations. If something gets missed, and we're all human and things change, and sometimes you get guidance from various departments and then they change their minds.
Yeah.
And that happens.
Yep.
And we keep emails to when
Exactly.
an important thing is memorialized,
Yeah.
so that when we go back and if somebody second guesses it, we say, hey, this was vetted last July, and then it still might get overruled, but at least we've covered our base. All this stuff adds up to risk. So we're trying to minimize the risk for the developer and for us, to minimize those costs where you end up having to buy the sidewalk. That's
Exactly.
a painful thing to do.
It was. And I'm glad we worked it out. We actually, this particular city wanted to work it out. And the city manager said, look, let's get in a room and work this out. What happened was there were bonus height provisions that were recently written, and the way that they were written, it could have been construed either way. So the city looked at it one way, whereas our architect at the time looked at it a different way. So, and it was final design review, they'd approved it multiple times. So that's what happened.
Those subjective determinants are really important to clarify, because zoning and building codes are written to be interpreted by the local building official. And for the building codes perspective, it's written by the ICC based in Chicago. They will give you a ruling, but it still can be overruled by the local jurisdiction. That's how they're written, and they're not black and white. So it's important to kind of pick through those issues too. So a lot of things that go into that yield study that are important.
Absolutely.
At the front end of it.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
All right. Second question.
Okay.
Robin, we're going to talk about eliminating cost. So on this particular project, we actually were able to eliminate one floor of parking. So we worked with this particular jurisdiction, and for this project to pencil, the cost, Robin had mentioned it in our last session, parking is expensive. So we had to obviously go through parking studies, and we showed evidence to the city of, hey, we think our project can support less parking than what is required by the code. Cost savings, I know we've talked about it, but especially on parking or any other cost savings, what have you done, Robin, or seen developers do to save money, save costs?
Sure. Well, let's talk about parking for a minute. So parking, structured parking, as I mentioned last time, is like $20,000 to $30,000. It can be more than that. Light rail has parking structures that cost a lot more than that. The state's developing them. So we try to do surface parking instead of that. We also try to figure out what latitude we have between what the zoning code says and what kind of relief there might be for that. And that might be a parking study. There might not be any wiggle room at all, but I've noticed in the last 5 years that even Bellevue, for example, allows more flexibility than they did 5 years ago. And Seattle now allows you to challenge every single use in their code, in their zoning code, and reduce that parking if we can prove it through a traffic engineer. So we do that. And then we also have to work with the client and figure out what their comfort level is. We have eight-story projects near Seattle Center that have 130 units with 12 parking stalls. And Seattle, in these urban villages, doesn't even require parking. This developer chose to put that parking in there because they had to build a basement anyway for some building services. So they're going to rent those spaces as for those tenants who really want that parking stall. But that's really on their decision. The city isn't requiring any parking at all for whatever reason. Some jurisdictions are like that. So parking is a big deal, and it's one of the things that really determines how dense a project can be. So we work through that issue at the very early stages of feasibility. Other things you can do to save, or I mentioned this last time too, is building the tallest building you can build, or the biggest building you can build, with the most affordable construction type, and that makes a big difference. You know, we have our client has a project in West Seattle that we're not involved in that's 6 stories. It's all concrete. You would normally not do that. The reason they're building it out of concrete is it's condos, and they want that extra safety measure that we don't have any combustible construction that can decompose, which is a big, there's a lot of litigation with that. So they chose to do that, and they're going to pass that cost on to the buyers, and it will, and it's waterfront property, so it'll translate. But in general, you wouldn't do that. You build, the tallest wood building you can build is 8 stories, and it's literally 1 inch below a high-rise standard. That's what we do. We set it so that top floor is slightly less than 75 feet from the lowest, from the fire access level. And if you were 1 inch higher, you'd add, maybe $400,000 of cost in high-rise. So to build a high-rise that's 8 stories or 9 stories is nonsense. It doesn't make sense. And if you encounter a project where that's the intent, if you buy a feasibility study or something, and those are the first things you should be looking for is does it pencil, and can it be done with a cheaper construction type?
Yeah. No, good questions. Yeah, good questions to ask, and great thoughts. Okay, next we're going to talk about density maximization, and design-wise in this particular project, we were looking. We actually worked and were able to get the height limit increased, but then we were looking at probably around 90 units. And what we ended up doing, and you've seen our design, the floor plans. We had a courtyard. That actually, we're glad we did, but the truth is, the courtyard being as small as it is, those interior units are a little dark. So our rent for those units aren't nearly as good as the exterior units, which have a lot more sunlight. They're still great units, but we did maximize the density on those units. So what are your thoughts with density maximization versus design aesthetics, and what you've seen some of your clients do, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I think you got to look at privacy as the issue, and access to views and sunlight. And as we mentioned this when we were talking offline, some jurisdictions have metrics for that, others don't. Seattle, for example, has separation between balconies, but it doesn't talk about a separation between a unit looking directly into another. Redmond does, most jurisdictions don't. But based on experience, the taller the building it is, the more separation you want. And that's logical because, just the deeper the building is, that courtyard has less and less sunlight access. And in general, we have 8 stories that have about 24-foot wide courtyards. That's pretty urban, pretty narrow. I wouldn't want to go below that. In Redmond, by the way, that would be a 55-foot wide courtyard based on their standards.
Yeah, this building wouldn't fly in Redmond.
Right.
Like you mentioned that.
Yeah. So that said, it's all about the perimeter, the window wall. So what you did in your project in Des Moines is you increased the perimeter wall area by having that courtyard. So that obviously enables you to double load the corridor and get more units in there. What we're seeing is if you can build what we call urban ones or open ones, which is essentially a pretty relatively small unit that actually has a bedroom internal pushed off that window wall. And those units are in the neighborhood of 350 to 400 or 500 square feet, but they're relatively narrow. They're 16 feet wide as opposed to 22 feet wide. And 22 feet, 20 feet is about the width you need for a bedroom and a living room on that window wall. 16 feet, 15 feet, you can do an urban one. You can get a lot more density that way. But you got to have a jurisdiction that can tolerate that. If the demographic isn't going to be interested in that small of a unit, like in Oklahoma, for example, then there's no point in building it. I've noticed anecdotally in the last 20 years that every year these units get smaller and smaller, not just in really urban areas like Seattle, but to Portland, for example, Redmond, Renton, Linwood. The more urban it is, the smaller the units. We have projects in Portland that are 140 square feet, and they're
Wow.
50 units on a 4,000 square foot lot. So
Yeah,
it's
that's
very dense.
That's is that 100 square foot less than what is the minimum is in Seattle?
Yeah, in Seattle,
right?
CDUs, small efficiency dwelling units, are about 240 square feet now. So yeah, it's about 100 square feet less than that. Portland doesn't have limits on how small a unit can be.
Wow.
Seattle does.
Yeah, I did not know that. Wow. Yeah. And that actually, next question. In this particular project, we had a great mix of 1 and 2 bedroom units actually, but COVID-wise, what are you seeing? What do you think COVID is going to do demand-wise?
Well, I think we touched on this last time. Well, in terms of demand, I don't see any letdown in projects in the pipeline or projects starting or being financed. That hasn't been an issue in the Northwest. But as far as design goes for these units, I think there's a likelihood that more people are going to be working from their home, whether that's an apartment, townhome, single-family residence, or maybe doing 3 days a week at home and 2 days at the office. That paradigm is changing. I think I read that 90% of Seattle's office space is leased, but 10% of it is occupied currently. When those leases are up, who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And there's an office building right next to our office in Pioneer Square. Started it, tore down an old warehouse building, going to build an 8-story office. They stopped it, and it's been sitting. It's not our project, but it's sitting, waiting. I don't know. They're probably going to redesign it into condos or something. But it was a speculative office building, and maybe it just doesn't make sense with looking 5 years down the road, how much office is going to be available.
Yeah. No, that'll be it'll be very interesting to see. Yeah, interesting to see what happens. Last question.
Yeah.
Robin, what to you? What makes a no-brainer deal from an architecture or design perspective currently?
Well, I mean, I think something that I touched on buildings that don't make sense, like 9-story buildings don't make sense. To a certain extent, 4-story buildings don't really make sense. It depends. There's a lot of variables there, but you really want to max out what the building code gives you. And for example, an apartment building that's all wood is 5 stories. That's how big you can go. Now in Seattle, you can do 6 stories of wood through an AMM process that gets into cross-laminated timber. But generally, an 8-story building is, I think, the best example of what I'm talking about, because to do an 8-story building, this is relatively new in the code, you do 3 stories of concrete, type 1A, and then 5 stories of type 3A. Seattle now allows you to do 6 stories of type 3A on top of that concrete. That building composes a lot of volume, and it includes a lot of wood. Wood has a lot lower embodied energy than concrete or steel. It's better for the environment, and it's probably the future. They're building high-rises out of wood in Vancouver and Portland, in Europe. They will shortly be building high-rises out of wood here.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing, mostly using cross-laminated timber, but all that translates into more value for both the user and I think for the developer as well. Makes it more cost efficient. But we try to be efficient in our designs, and I think any architect does. We try to utilize the site as much as well as possible in terms of how it's oriented and how the parking is on site, whether it's under the building or it's not there at all, or it's on surface, and utilizing an efficient layout with vertical circulation, and then how and whether it has mixed use attached to that, how that's integrated in the building as well.
Yeah.
These are all things that make the building work better and work for the bottom line.
Yeah.
And they're all things that should be worked out really early on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
For a building making sense in penciling.
Right.
Well, Robin, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great stuff. As that about wraps us up. So thanks for watching, and catch us on the next one, everybody. Have a great day.